Know the truth, and the truth will set you free. We've heard this all our lives, but how do you know when someone's not telling the truth? Well, as it turns out, lying is something that everybody does. Yeah, all of us, even the good guys, lie. This is part one of a two-part program on why people lie, the science, psychology, and consequences. We'll look at what this means to you and what can be done about it. Joining me are Dr. Daniel Krawczyk of the University of Texas at Dallas and Dr. Michael Lundie, staff cognitive scientist and owner of the Psychological Sciences Group of ARA. Welcome to you both. Glad to have you here.
Thank you.
Wonderful to be here.
Oh, you bet. This has been a fascinating discussion as we were preparing for this show, and you've turned this little topic, you would think lying pretty simple straight up, into a very complex and fascinating subject for me, and I know it will be for our viewers as well. So let me explore a few things here. You are literally professional researchers into the field of deception and lies and the impact that has on people and on society. So amazing.
Well, I think of myself as a reasoning researcher, and a huge part of reasoning,
like that.
human reasoning, is reasoning with other people, social reasoning. You know, that involves reading other people, trying to understand what their goals are, what's making them tick, what are their incentives.
What they call reading the room.
And exactly, reading the room. And we're a social primate. And one of our superpowers is that we can cooperate in large numbers, and we can also compete with one another. And so it is a large challenge to work with other people to determine, what do they know? What are they telling me? What are they not telling me? And it's actually very difficult for us to read lies. So a lot of the research hovers around 53%, 54% accuracy is about what most people most of the time can determine if they're being lied to.
A coin toss is just about as good as that.
Slightly better than chance.
So our ability, though we probably perceive ourselves as pretty good at detecting lies, we call it a BS detector sometimes, we're a lot better at detecting them than we actually are?
Well, it's difficult because we often assume we're being told the truth. It's called truth bias, and most of the time we probably are being told the truth. Unless something is discrepant with known facts, or you're getting some very obvious signs, like a bad poker tell. That seems more theoretical than what really happens, because so often, we're trying to think about what someone's telling us, and also what we can contribute to it, what it means for us. We're not focusing on, are they lying to me? And maybe we can aim our attention in that way. It's just not our default setting. It's coupled, right? That's like social intuition.
Yeah.
And I think all of us have, first impressions do matter. We can sometimes just get like a spider sense or a tingling feeling of that. That doesn't quite, my intuitions, I don't really like that person. I can't particularly say why. The difficulty there is that sometimes if we're anxious, we will look in, the wrong places or seem fidgety. And so it's very hard to say, well, is that someone lying, or is that merely someone that's just a little bit uncomfortable right now? Mm-hmm. And so actually understanding the social cues is quite difficult for us. And I would say lying can sometimes evoke certain clues within certain people, but then some are very good at lying, and they're very fluid in their delivery, at which point there's little to go on.
Well, and the people have made a profession out of that, being a con artist. Michael, what, in your own experience and research, how's that borne out?
No, I think it's a great setup for me. My first foray into this area of research into deception is in online disinformation campaigns, how it happens on social media platforms, when you're in the wild trying to ascertain truths about important policy discussions, or you're just trying to interact with others online. This is a very treacherous territory. And I think there's a bit of cynicism involved in these online interactions, in that we expect that most people are not giving us the full, authentic, unvarnished version of themselves, with filters showing how we wish we looked.
So how did you get fascinated by this whole field?
What fascinated me was things like confirmation bias. how is it that we seem to have such a sensitivity to information that confirms the beliefs that we hold, and makes it difficult for us to absorb information that cuts against our beliefs, and what we'll do in service of the beliefs that we hold, ideologies we have fealty
give
towards.
us an example.
Yeah.
Confirmation bias for
Sure.
those that have heard the term
Sure.
but don't really know what that means.
Right. So let's say I have a certain opinion on gun control policy,
Okay.
right? And let's say I'm more of like a fundamentalist when it comes to Second Amendment rights,
All
right?
right.
I might read a study that shows that in a certain location, some sort of gun control measure was put in place and crime rates went down, right? I might look for some sort of reason to explain why this occurred such that it protects my beliefs. And I also think most audience members can attest to this, that these conversations oftentimes will immediately go to the source of the information, not the content. And might say, well, wait a minute. What's the fealty? What flag does that source fly? And they might think, oh, well, what they're doing is they're just engaging in a game of deception in order to convince me that my truth is not in fact the truth. And again, gets back to the cynicism about having goodwill, good faith conversations that we're all trying to actually use our words to represent the world as it actually is.
So we've got a pretty dangerous little minefield out there when it comes to finding where the truth is. How do we go forth into all that with a better ability to detect what's true and what's not true? I mean, there's so much research that you've been through that I've seen in the brain research, and both of you for that matter. I could rattle on, but I
think an answer.
Give us a sense of what came out of all that.
So what you talked about earlier, Thin Slice, the
Yeah.
Malcolm Gladwell book, and those very rapid exposures that can give us some sense, and maybe emotionally, of what we're dealing with in a given person. I think a remedy is to spend more time with the person. I feel as if, as a receiver of information, in an interaction, it's helpful to have a charitable attitude. Even if you do suspect deception, take time to really unravel the thread more. Just ask more questions. Keep your guard up if necessary. But the brain does a better job with more information intake. Don't make snap judgments. Don't judge someone based on a first impression and proceed to stereotype them, because that again comes back to confirmation bias.
Yeah.
You're sort of seeking to label and judge and then move on with your life, which isn't a particularly satisfying thing to do as a social being.
Well, really kind of dovetailing with what Dan just shared here, besides just having a charitable attitude, in addition, create an environment of vulnerability and openness. I think the first place I go to when I think about somebody who engages in deception as a strategy for social interaction, you're dealing with someone with a very fragile sense of self and self-value, and they create a sort of masquerade, a sort of atmosphere of something that's going to garner praise and be impressive, because they truthfully don't have a lot of value in themselves. So human beings, we're reciprocal creatures. If we can create that atmosphere of, I'm willing to be upfront and honest about my flaws, about the things that are not most impressive aspects of myself, makes other people at ease. They feel like, oh, I don't have to play this game where I have to be the most impressive person in the world all the time. Oftentimes we put so much pressure on ourselves to never have any flaws, and this militates in favor of trying to exaggerate certain features of ourselves and then sort of courts or flirts with deception. And oftentimes when we see people who are famous con men throughout history, you can see the look of relief on their faces, ambivalence about being caught, because they can
Bernie Madoff.
Yes. It's like, finally, I can relax, I can drop the... Because you said, it is a hollow existence.
And there's a strange phenomenon that happens nowadays. Often it's a job interview if you're lying to someone. If you commit a grand act of ransomware, chances are that company may actually try to hire you because you've infiltrated their system and you're the best qualified person to tell them how to block that. So we've actually, it is an arms race of sorts where you, and who better to help with that sort of, provided then you could trust them as an employee. That's a whole different ethical question.
Ironic.
But I do think we need to keep our guard up as well. Having a charitable charitable attitude is good socially. However, being appropriately skeptical, especially in reading the room, situational awareness is a phrase that comes to mind. We don't expect to be lied to across our lives, but in certain circumstances, like desperate times calling for desperate measures, we should probably assume that everyone is potentially playing a game. Or, if you're sitting down at a poker table, do not expect honesty. It's not the time for a charitable conversation. So it's within the human repertoire
your ability to deceive
or
something
be
to be
yes.
extremely proud of if you're a poker tournament player.
And we do celebrate that act in others, like in sporting arenas, the coach that is able to put his defense in a particular way that the offense simply cannot read what they're going to do, and we celebrate that as a highlight.
You see that
Yes.
So
for me.
that tells us something about deception is part of the toolkit to engage with other people, and then it's the context in which we need to be aware of it.
Well, Dan, talk with us about framing. What do you mean by framing?
Yes, the framing effect was discovered really by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, Nobel laureates in behavioral economics. And what that is about is it's just like art. You can frame it a certain way. You can present it in a positive light. If we're selling beef, we're going to want to advertise 80% lean, not 20% fat. Same information.
Good point.
It's just you're selectively highlighting certain elements of it. And this isn't outright lying, perhaps. It's highlighting a facet of the truth and ignoring
to the absence
another.
Of the other.
And that's immensely powerful because, people in advertising know about this. And
2% butterfat.
Well, you can think of all kinds of examples, and I think a good case for it is also in our legal system. So, we happen to adjudicate the truth by having two lawyers frame it as if their side is 100% correct, and then we judge the two best laid out framings and try to get to the truth. So I think a lot of information presented to us is framed, and we want to frame things in a way that it will be well received without crossing the line into absolutely fabricating. There is a difference there, and we know that difference. And so I think that's an important skill, the art of good framing, but not crossing the line into doing something unethical.
What's your experience from a sports point of view as it comes to all this that you know and understand about lying?
I think it really ties quite nicely to this outcome bias subject you just raised, where the most important thing is the outcome. Have we won or not?
Yeah.
And everything else is subordinated to that, including the truth, right? If it's convenient, if it facilitates victory, sure, we're going to use it as an implement. But if it stands in the way as a hurdle, then I'm going to jettison that, right? And part of the reason for this is there's a bit of cynicism in assuming everyone else is playing the same game, right? When I first thought about this subject, one of the most powerful, insightful explorations of this topic, I think, is from the philosopher Joe Austin. What he highlights is all the dimensions of how we use our words. You just gave a classic example of using language to represent something about reality, where the context, where the true north of whether I'm doing this well is, am I representing reality as clearly as possible? But there are other dimensions of being a human being besides just representing things accurately. There is dimensions of manipulating people, performative acts of language. In fact, we know this. The con man type individual navigates a Machiavellian world where other human beings are chess pieces that need to be moved, and that's why they're using language. The problem, though, is that you have to understand that's the software they're running. That's the game that they're playing, right? But it's oftentimes not the default. It's one of the reasons why it takes an extra beat or two for us to adopt that more reflective processing, to be able to reason and recognize, oh, this is the dimension of how they're using their words, to manipulate, not to represent things about the world.
Just yesterday, I was parked in a parking lot in Austin, Texas, coincidentally, where the warning sign about be sure and pay before you leave, was worded in a way that it could easily be misinterpreted to leave, come back, and pay upon departure. Or, don't you dare leave your car until you've paid. And they had a guy waiting with a boot to put it on the cars to disable them. And they were getting like 4 or 5 an hour that they were able to disable because of the ambiguity of the sign. And I did some calculations, and odds are in favor of them making $1,000 a day off of that parking lot, which $365,000 a year. Holy smokes, what an enterprise. And it's all with just the manipulation, like you were saying, of the words. How do we protect ourselves against these things?
Well, the world's fraught with ambiguity. And this is actually, I think, a case where sometimes believing lies comes from this, the initial ambiguity. And it's like, well, it's really inconvenient if they're lying because we have to cut off you have to call them out on it. We have to cut off the relationship. So you let it pass. And eventually, if it's really a con artist you're dealing with, they're kind of stringing you along long enough that you begin to think, well, I couldn't possibly have been deceived this long. And so you start to become complicit in it. And we all are the hero of our own story, and our memory is often edited around that. So we don't want to admit that we're being taken in. So it can be quite a devious plot that plays out where the ambiguity can sometimes just, we're too charitable and we are too trusting, and then we almost can't admit that we're being taken advantage of, which is incredibly bad place to be.
What about our memory? People say, well, hey, I remember, this is exactly how it happened. Well, but you filtered that exactly into your point of view, your biases, your preferences, your hopes, your whatever, and a whole bunch of other filters before it got to home base to be restated. And even then, once you've restated it once or twice, told the story a couple times, don't you start remembering the story you told more than the fact you observed?
That's exactly right. Memory is plastic and fluid and changeable, and we have to keep that in mind throughout our lives. And this is the source of a lot of discrepancies at the Thanksgiving dinner table and some arguments, because your version and my version are true in our own heads. And so you have to kind of keep that in mind too. Someone can appear to be lying, but they're actually just sort of reflecting these exaggerations that have gone on over years or over retelling. It's kind of the proverbial fishtail. It was this big, but now it's this big. In that person's mind, it really is this big because they've kind of selectively modified it unintentionally. And we're not perfect at judging others, but we're also not perfect at judging our own story. And so I think that's another case for, before we accuse somebody, let's again try to peel back the layers of the onion a little bit more to see, how did they come to see that as what happened? Because we're all looking at it from different vantage points.
Zig Ziglar had a great line. He said, it's a mighty poor speaker can't tell a story better than it happened. For entertainment. Go ahead.
Of course. Like, who wants to read a story like a bailiff, right?
Yeah.
Where you're just like monotone and like, okay, well, is it 4:33 p.m.? Like, that's not the way it works, right? You want to create entertainment because, Jim's a good question for you. What do you think our economy is built on? What is the greatest incentive that drives human behavior?
In our economy?
Yeah. What do you think?
Money.
Yes.
But
it's actually attention. Think about it. That's the gateway.
I was thinking it can't be money. That's too easy.
Right. So to get your money, I need to get your attention first. And it's one of the things that it militates in favor of exaggeration, hyperbole. Because I need to get your attention, I need to hold it. And that's a scarce resource. And it's one of the reasons why we tend to use sort of like the equivalent of inflection, right? Anything we can use with our words in order to string out details, move things out of proportion, anything that's going to hold someone's attention, be entertaining, and convince somebody. Especially when it comes to fears, exaggerating fears in order to move people to perform certain actions. It's very important in politics, especially. You want to keep people to donate, when people get involved, do costly actions. You better convince them that whatever it is that they're running from, or whatever it is that they're afraid of, actually is a genuine threat to them, and that involves the art of storytelling and exaggerating details. I think a lot of it comes down to, honestly, it might sound like a cynical interpretation, but I don't think it really is. It's just understanding, well, what are the rules of this game, first of all, when it comes to advertising, marketing? What are they trying to do? Well, they're trying to get my attention. They're trying to convince me that this is the most important issue of the world. Right? If I'm going to see, an infomercial about donating to a cause, let's say for saving puppies
Yeah.
or saving
Homeless
starving
people
Yeah,
or something like
exactly.
that, yeah.
They're trying to convince you it's the most important issue in the world, and that's their job, right? And I understand that. That's actually more of a compassionate take on what they're doing. It's like they're trying to do their job very well, trying to
Yeah.
convince me that this is worth my time and attention, and that puts me in a stance of giving a more reflective take on why they're trying to frame things in a certain way. Why do they choose those words? Why do they put it that way, right? Thinking it more of like a strategic frame of mind,
Yeah.
as opposed to just the content, thinking about the style as well, about how they frame things.
What do you lose as a result of making that step over the line?
Well, I'll start by saying your reputation, right? The longer term route to success is trust, and this is a big part of the economy as well. If we don't trust our currency and we don't trust our banks and one another, we don't get anything done. We're a failed state, and so I think that we can aim our compass really at trust, and it also feels good. I think psychologically, it's very hard to sustain lies. They're corrosive to our character. They take a lot of attention. And I think most of us who've developed sort of a moral sense, assuming you're not talking about someone who's like a clinical sociopath,
Yeah.
It really does erode one's comfort with one's life. And this is why in counseling and in therapy, coming forth with the truth is incredibly therapeutic. It's almost a breath of fresh air. So, it's telling the truth is good for you psychologically. Mm-hmm. And if more of us do it, it builds a better society. I think we want to do good work in the world, right? And that social interactions are satisfying in a way that almost nothing else is. And if we're taking advantage of others and we just see them as a mark in our scheme, that may feel good in the moment to have fleeced someone, or to let's say a legal setting. If you're taking over this company, buying it out in a hostile way, it may feel good in the moment that you've really scored a big victory for your team. But the problem is we're not at war with everyone in society, right?
Yeah.
There is times to build bridges, and I think so often we have this misperception that a really shrewd business person takes advantage and gets the lion's share for themselves always.
Yeah, they say, hey, it's only business, not personal. Heck, it's not. If it affected me, it is.
But if you look at someone like Warren Buffett, who
Yeah.
has just invested in great companies, not the most interesting or dazzling companies, but he's just consistently picked winners and played the long game, and he becomes wildly successful.
And
so
highly trusted.
and trusted as well. And I think that is something that we can all aim for in our lives.
Very good. Thank you.
When someone engages in acts of deception, they're also injuring themselves, right? You're alienating yourself from who you aspire to be, right? Someone who actually is competent, as actually the person they pretend to be. And every act of deception is you're robbing yourself of an opportunity to actually grow. Be authentically the very person who, as your example of the Catch Me If You Can character, to really be an airline pilot,
Yeah.
to actually be the things he pretends to be. Because a really full life, if we want to get very philosophical about this, are genuine experiences to grow and stretch yourself, put yourself outside of your comfort zone. And then oftentimes being able to tell hard truths about yourself, not just the things you're capable of, the things you can't do. And these are opportunities to affiliate, because then you'll understand that you have skill gaps that other people can fill for you because they have great competencies, and only because of your disclosure and your honesty about the things you can't do, you end up building up partnerships where you have mutually cohesive groups that are able to solve large problems together.
Well, I need to wrap this together, and I want to thank both of you for a valuable contribution, because we've shifted a lot of people's thinking. I know it's shifted mine, so it's bound to have a domino effect out there on what's the nature of it and how can we avoid it and why should we avoid it, because there is a bigger, deeper payoff. So as you can see, it's not as simple as we once thought. Lying is a part of every culture, is directly related to the level of trust and cooperation between people. So I want to thank both of my guests. I want to thank Dan and Michael. You were very generous to join us today. So join us again for part 2 of this program as we look into the personal impact lying has upon you and me. You will hear 2 more fascinating perspectives as we continue to talk about things that matter, with people who care.